In the quiet hills of Colorado, a war veteran and his loyal canine partner uncover a buried military secret that the government would kill to erase. When Rex refuses to leave the door of a hospital room no one is supposed to enter, it sparks a journey that unravels a Black Ops experiment, brings back a lost soldier from the shadows, and exposes a chain of silence going back years. As allies emerge from the unlikeliest places and enemies strike from within, the line between justice and survival blurs. But even after the hearings end and the cameras turn away, some truths remain hidden. The dog who wouldn't give up is still listening. What was really lost in room 209, and what price will they pay to keep the peace they've found? The answer waits just past the last bark. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The wind moved like a whisper between the mountains, brushing over the rooftops of Pine Bluff, Colorado, a quiet town that held its breath in silence more often than not. It was the kind of place where people nodded in passing, but rarely stopped, long enough to ask questions. Out here, privacy wasn't just respected, it was expected, but sometimes silence hides more than comfort. Sometimes it hides the sound before the storm. Daniel Rourke stepped out of his truck with the practiced calm of a man who'd once moved through war zones like they were kitchen halls. The gravel under his boots shifted as he shut the door behind him, his eyes automatically scanning the tree line before settling on the weathered fence of the training yard. It was muscle memory, not paranoia. At least that's what he told himself. The sun had barely crested the ridgeline, casting long shadows across the property. Inside the yard, Rex was already standing alert, as if he'd sensed Dan from the moment the truck turned off the highway. The dog's amber eyes were sharp, his stance straight, almost military in its discipline. He wasn't just a dog, he was a partner, a soldier, and the only soul on earth Dan trusted without question. "Morning, boy," Dan muttered, his voice gravelled by years of shouting through sandstorms and explosions. Rex didn't bark. He didn't wag. He simply waited for the command. By 8, the first responders from the County K9 unit had started arriving. Officers in uniform, some green, some hardened, gathered around the yard. Dan's words were few. He taught with actions more than instruction. Rex demonstrated most of it anyway. The dog obeyed with surgical precision, and when he latched onto a padded arm or tracked a scent through mud and chaos, even the cocky ones stopped talking. The day moved slow but solid. It was only at noon that Dan allowed himself the luxury of a sandwich on the porch, looking out over the ridge. That was when the call came in from Memorial Hospital. Therapy visit, pediatric ward. Thought you'd bring Rex again if he's up for it. Dan looked at Rex. The dog, resting at his feet, lifted his head slightly as if he already knew. "Yeah," Dan said. "We'll be there in an hour." The hospital always smelled like antiseptic and quiet grief. Dan hated it. But Rex didn't seem to mind. He moved through the pediatric ward like he belonged there, calm, steady, gentle with the tiny hands that reached out from sterile beds. For a creature built for aggression, he carried an impossible softness with children. Nurses smiled. Parents wept. The kids beamed. It was a different kind of battlefield, but one where Rex still won hearts instead of territory. Dan was halfway through signing a thank you form at the front desk when it started. A growl, low, guttural, steady. Dan looked down. Rex was planted, unmoving, his eyes locked down the hall like he was staring at a ghost. The growl deepened, turned into a snarl. "Rex," Dan warned. The dog didn't budge, then he bolted. Dan chased him down the corridor as startled staff and parents jumped out of the way. Rex sprinted toward the east wing, his paws thudding on the polished floor. When he stopped, it was in front of room 209. Dan caught up, breathing heavy. "Rex! What the hell are you?" Rex barked, loud, furious. A warning, not a call. Dan froze. Room 209 was supposed to be empty. He looked at the door. It had no nameplate, no patient chart. Every document on the Thalassa program is public now. Dan didn't flinch. He only nodded. Good. And Keene's foundation received federal funding, she added. They're building a second refuge. Georgia, Joe whistled. Guess. The fire's spreading. Dan smiled faintly. That's what fires do. Later that day, a small ceremony was held at the edge of the property. No press, no politicians. Just a gathering of those who had been part of the journey. Sarah drove up from Denver. Carson Rudd flew in from Texas. Even Marshall, the former mercenary, attended, standing quietly in the back, his expression thoughtful, unreadable. They weren't there to celebrate any one person. They were there to bury a time capsule. Dan had resisted the idea at first, but Emma pushed for it, a gesture for the future, something for others to find one day, long after all of them were gone. Inside the capsule went a few photos, a hard drive with testimony archives, a copy of the whistleblower files, and one of Rex's service tags. No speeches were made, but as the final shovel of dirt covered the box, Dan stepped forward and placed a smooth stone atop the mound. It had been hand-painted by a child in town. It simply read, "Stay, like Rex." That evening, back on the porch, the sky turned orange behind the mountains. Dan sat with Rex again, rubbing the old dog's back as the air cooled. "You know," Joe said, looking out over the land, "we didn't win every battle." "No," Dan replied, "but we didn't let them win either." Emma nodded. "That's enough." A truck passed by on the dirt road below. A family waved from inside. They had visited the refuge just the week before. The father had carried a cane and a weight in his shoulders. When he left, the weight seemed lighter. Dan watched until the truck vanished around the bend. "I used to think legacy was medals or plaques," he said. "What is it now?" Emma asked. Dan looked down at Rex, who was still watching the road. "Even now, even at rest, it's the lives you help carry when they can't carry themselves." As the sun slipped behind the trees, Rex shifted slowly, placing his head on Dan's lap with a soft groan. Dan ran a hand through the thick fur, feeling the warmth, the years, the loyalty. In the distance, near the kennel yard, a puppy barked, high-pitched, excited. A new recruit, barely a year old, already showing promise. Rex's ears twitched at the sound. Dan smiled. "Time to pass the torch, old man." Rex didn't move, but his tail thumped once against the floor. And for Dan Rourke, in that fading light, with the mountains holding the last color of day, it was all the answer he needed. The mission was never about ending the fight. It was about making sure no one had to fight alone. Not then, not now, not ever. And somewhere, in every corner of this country, people were still listening to the echo of a bark that refused to be ignored, because the dog never gave up, and neither did those who chose to follow him. And a woman stepped out, grey coat, folder in hand, Agent Whitaker. She didn't wave, she didn't smile, just nodded and said, "The vote passed committee, it's going to the floor." Dan gave a tired smile. "Good. You started something." "Here," she said. Dan shook his head. "We just refuse to stop it." That night a small celebration was held in the barn. No music, just coffee, stories, and the kind of silence that comes when people finally feel safe. Carson was there, helping build more bunks. Emma read out loud from a letter Keene had sent from the facility, where he now taught therapy workshops for at-risk. Veterans Joe toasted with a chipped mug. "To the dog that didn't move," he said. Everyone raised theirs. Rex thumped his tail once, then laid his head on his paws. And in that moment, surrounded by those who'd once been forgotten, a community exhaled as one. They had turned light into pressure, and pressure into change. The early spring sun stretched across the valley like a promise, turning frost to dew and coaxing the first green blades from the soil. Pine Bluff felt warmer, fuller, alive in a way it hadn't in years. The Holloway refuge buzzed quietly, with preparation, not for drills, not for another hearing or an emergency, but for something far simpler, far more profound. Rex's 10th birthday. The idea had come from Bobby, one of the younger veterans staying on the property. He'd survived 2 tours in Syria and still flinched at backfiring engines. But when he found Rex curled beside him after a panic attack, something clicked. That night, he went to Dan and said, "He's done more for me than any therapist I've had. We should celebrate him like we would a hero." Dan hadn't said anything, but the next morning, lumber appeared for picnic tables, and Emma started collecting RSVP emails from half the country. By the time the day arrived, trucks were lining the outer fields, banners were hung, and folding chairs had been set up in rows across the yard. No uniforms, no rank, just people who had been changed by the same dog one way or another. Soldiers, nurses, trainers, even civilians who'd seen the news footage and felt something stir. Dan stood on the porch of the main lodge, one hand in his pocket, the other gripping a weathered leash. Rex sat beside him, watching the crowd gather. He didn't bark, he didn't move quickly anymore, but his eyes still held that calm, focused depth, like he was counting every soul in the crowd just to be sure. Emma stepped up beside Dan. "He looks good," she said. Dan glanced down. "He's tired, but he's still watching." "Just like you," she replied. The event wasn't formal. No speeches, no press. But word had spread. The town of Pine Bluff showed up in force. Kids from the local school brought drawings of Rex, crayon sketches of him leading soldiers or sitting with a child in a hospital bed. A high school music teacher gathered a small group to play soft guitar tunes. Veterans from as far as Montana drove down just to shake Dan's hand and pet the dog that, in many ways, had pulled them out of their own personal darkness. At one point, Emma took the mic, not for ceremony, but for context. "This dog," she said, "didn't sniff out bombs or chase down suspects in the traditional way. What Rex did was harder. He stayed. In every moment of pain, confusion, or danger, he never left the side of the people who needed him. He saw what the rest of us missed, and he barked until we listened." No one applauded. They just stood. Quiet, respectful, eyes shining. Near midday, a van rolled up to the edge of the field. Dan recognized it instantly. The VA transport. From it stepped 5 men, 4 in plain clothes, 1 in a federal escort jacket. And behind them, moving slowly, Kane. In hand was Alex Keene. He'd aged. His posture was a little worse, but his eyes were steady. Dan met him halfway across the yard. "No cameras," Keene said. Dan shook his hand. "None, just family." Rex sniffed the air before Alex even reached them. When he did, the old dog took a few slow steps and sat at his feet, resting his head against the man's knee like no time had passed. Keene choked up. "I've been clean for over a year," he said. "No sedation, no blackouts, and I still don't sleep more than 3 hours. But this dog, he's the only thing I never forgot." Dan nodded. "He remembers you too. The afternoon turned easy after that. People shared stories. Joe grilled enough meat to feed 2 platoons. Emma passed around old photos of Rex, training shots, hospital visits, even that grainy security camera still from room 209. No one said it out loud, but they all felt it. That moment when everything had changed. That bark, that refusal to move, the spark of the entire movement. A man stepped forward as the sun began to dip. Grey hair, clean-shaven in a wheelchair, pushed by his daughter. He'd never met Dan, never spoken to Rex, but he introduced himself with quiet reverence. "I was one of the tech analysts assigned to Subject K," he said. "Back when I thought I was just following orders. I saw what they did to him. I saw how he fought it. I never stepped in, but I never slept right since." He reached into his coat and handed Dan a USB stick. "I think it belongs here. It's the raw logs, the real logs, the ones they scrubbed." Dan took it without a word. Sometimes truth comes late, but it still matters. As the sun disappeared behind the hills, someone lit a fire pit. People gathered close. A few pulled out harmonicas, hand drums, The music wasn't loud, just enough to carry through the cold. Rex sat close to Dan, head up, listening. A child, maybe 5, wandered over and gently wrapped a scarf around his neck. "He's like a soldier, right?" she asked. Dan nodded. "The best kind," he said. Later that night, after the last guests left and the fire had died down to glowing embers, Dan stood at the edge of the barn. The air was cold, clear, the stars brighter than he remembered. Emma leaned against him, her breath fogging in the stillness. "We're not done," she said. "No," Dan agreed, "but we've made it further than I ever thought we would." Inside, Rex snored softly, wrapped in a blanket near the heater. Outside, the land slept easy. And across the country, people were watching, listening, organizing, all because one dog refused to be quiet, and a man had listened. The porch creaked as Dan shifted his weight in the old wooden chair, the same one he'd used for over a decade. It faced east, looking out over the valley where fog still pooled in the early morning hours and sunlight hadn't yet stretched over the pines. The barn sat quiet in the distance, its silhouette soft against the horizon. Birds chirped sparingly, as if they too understood that this hour didn't call for noise. Beside him, Rex rested with his head across Dan's worn boot, breathing slow, eyes half-lidded. He wasn't the young, alert canine he had once been, but even now, with a stiff gait and graying muzzle, he remained vigilant. Any sound that didn't belong, a shift in wind, a tire on gravel, his ears would catch it. Dan sipped his coffee. Black and bitter, the kind he always preferred. As steam rose from the mug, he looked out at the place that had changed more lives than he'd ever imagined. Holloway Refuge had grown. There were new cabins now, a proper veterinary clinic, and a dedicated therapy wing named after Emma's late mentor. The community had invested in them, not just in money or policy, but in trust. That had been the hardest to earn. Trust came slower than headlines, but it had arrived. On the porch railing was a stack of letters, some addressed to Rex, others to Dan, from veterans, from teachers, from kids who'd read about the dog who refused to move from a hospital door and ask their parents why more people didn't listen to animals. Dan had read them all. One stood out, written in crayon, in shaky, looping letters. "My dad smiles more now. He said your dog is brave. I think you are too. Someday I want to be like Rex." It was pinned to the barn wall, right under the plaque that read, "For those who still stand." Dan reached down and scratched behind Rex's ear. 10 years, he murmured. 10 good years. Rex exhaled deeply, not asleep but resting. Always resting, never quitting. Emma stepped out onto the porch, wrapped in a flannel coat, her hair still damp from the shower. She carried 2 more mugs and handed one to Joe, who had followed her out with the slow steps of someone learning to take his mornings a little easier. "Sleep okay?" she asked Dan. He nodded. "First time I didn't dream about the tunnels." "In weeks," Joe chuckled softly. "Miracles happen." They sat in silence, 3 people bound not by orders, but by everything they'd endured and built together. "I got a call from Whitaker," Emma said eventually. "The full declassification?" "Passed." Coffee steamed in battered metal cups. Dan stood in the back, arms crossed, while Joe leaned over a map marked with red pushpins and yellow flags, each one representing a whistleblower, a testimony in progress, or a journalist waiting for confirmation. They weren't leading anymore. They were facilitating. The movement had outgrown them. It started with a name, Alex Keene, a man broken and rebuilt who refused to stay silent. His testimony had sparked the first wave. Carson Rudd's confession fanned it into a flame, but it was the people who followed, those with no platform, no audience, who built it into something that couldn't be ignored. Across the country, stories poured in. Veterans stepping forward, medical staff who'd been ordered to falsify charts, engineers who helped build prototype sedation chambers, language analysts who'd tagged and buried emails with headers like behavioral override. Candidate 14B. Emma's desk overflowed with files. Joe kept a second laptop just for encryption. Dan read each report at night by the fire, his fingers tightening whenever he reached a page with redacted lines. And Rex? Rex still lay by the door. He listened, as always. One cold afternoon, a journalist from the Denver Independent arrived unannounced. Young, idealistic, eyes bloodshot from too many hours of scrolling through leaked files. "They're going to bury this," he said without preamble. "Langley's still out there. Nobody's touched him." Dan didn't answer right away. He poured the man coffee, slid a copy of Keene's letter across the table. "You're looking for closure," Dan finally said. "This isn't that. It's exposure." The journalist sat in silence, reading the words scrawled in Keene's jagged handwriting. "We expose what they hide. We don't fight shadows with knives. We use light." It was all the man needed. The next article wasn't just a feature, it was a catalyst. The headline, "Ghosts in Uniform, the soldiers they buried, and the dog that wouldn't let them." By February, the hearings in Washington gained traction. A new subcommittee was formed, focused on the ethics of private military research and behavioral control programs. Dan was invited to testify. He refused. Instead, he sent Emma. Her voice was calm, steady, professional. But when she showed them Rex's injury photos and the transcript of his reactions in room 209, the room went quiet. One senator stood and walked out. Another whispered, "God help us." Emma didn't ask for help. She asked for accountability. After that hearing, the tide shifted. The public started asking questions. News anchors stopped sanitizing the reports. A few high-ranking officials gave short, careful interviews, each one carefully distancing themselves from the Langley group. But then came the internal leaks, emails, invoices, handwritten notes with words like deep mode activation and neural obedience cascade. The world had seen enough. At the refuge, Dan and Joe met with a group of veterans from 3 different states. They weren't just there for therapy or companionship. They came to organize. One of them, a quiet Navy corpsman named Elias, had compiled a list of demands, not for revenge, for reform. A new bill was drafted. Emma helped with the language. Joe checked the background names. Dan ensured every clause protected the people, not the agencies. And on March 2nd, the Ethical Transparency in Defense Act was introduced to Congress. It wasn't flashy. It didn't promise justice overnight. But it required one thing no law had before: full declassification of behavioral experimentation on U.S. military personnel since 2001. Rex was present that day, sitting beside Emma at a press conference. He didn't bark, he didn't flinch. But when a reporter asked what role a dog could possibly play in a matter this serious, Emma leaned down and placed her hand on Rex's head. He remembered what they wanted the world to forget. As the spring thaw began to melt the snow from the hills, Dan walked the property with Rex beside him, boots crunching through wet grass and soft mud. New fences had been built. A second training ring was nearly finished. Volunteers were working on converting an old shed into a quiet meditation space for trauma recovery. Rex paused near the east fence, sniffed the wind. Dan followed his gaze to a black SUV parked at the edge of the road. For a second, the old tension returned, but the door opened. "And now I'm trying to do something else." Emma studied him carefully. "You were on the team sent to kill Keene." "I didn't fire a shot," Carson replied, "but I would have. If Langley had said the word. If it hadn't all gone sideways." Dan leaned forward, elbows on the table. "Why come now?" Carson didn't hesitate. "Because I saw the footage, and then I saw Keene testify. I watched it twice. The man I almost executed looked like every soldier I ever tried to forget. And your dog," his voice caught for a second, "your dog reminded me of one we lost in Kandahar. He didn't give up either." Rex, lying under the table, thumped his tail once. Emma broke the silence. "You have something for us?" Carson nodded and pulled a hard drive from his coat. "It's everything I've got," he said. Mission logs, contract data, personnel rosters, names, schedules, the stuff that never got uploaded to Langley's servers. I kept copies. For leverage? Back then, Dan took it gently, holding it like something delicate and dangerous. You realize this could put a lot of people away. I'm counting on it, Carson said. The next day, Joe and Emma worked on the drive in the back room. Passwords cracked, layers peeled back. It wasn't just intel, it was a roadmap. Proof of years of covert programs, private black site experiments, contractors who vanished after missions went wrong. Some names were already known to the press. Others had never seen daylight. Carson stayed for 3 days, not because they made him, because he asked to. He slept in one of the bunk rooms, helped shovel snow from the path, and sat with Rex every evening by the fire. Never asked for forgiveness. Never made excuses. He simply stayed. On the 4th morning, he approached Dan. I want to go public, he said. Testify, not just hand over the files. Dan stared at him for a long time. You sure you're ready for that kind of storm? Carson exhaled. I wasn't ready for the man I used to be either. Time I met this one head on. Emma arranged. The first interview with a contact in Washington. A veteran-turned-journalist who had already covered the Keene hearings. Carson sat in front of the camera, unshaven, face gaunt with truth. He didn't read a statement. He told stories of the missions they ran under false flags, of the men they were told to silence, of how many times they watched someone like Keene lose everything and did nothing. It was broadcast within hours, and it exploded. Not just on cable news, on message boards, in back channels. Among veterans who'd seen too much and said too little, Carson's story became a spark. 2 days later, another former operative reached out. Then 3 more. Then 5. Some had only heard whispers. Others had seen what Langley built from the inside. Joe created a secure server for them. Emma vetted each name. Dan listened to every story. Rex, somehow, knew who to trust, and the list grew. By Christmas, the Holloway Refuge had unofficially become the coordination hub for what one reporter called the Reckoning. But no one there used that word. They called it accountability, or healing, or simply doing what should have been done years ago. Carson stayed through the holiday. He didn't laugh much, but one night, as snow piled high outside the barn, he helped. Dan hung a small wood plaque near Keene's corner. It read, "Former enemy, new ally. We change or we vanish." Dan didn't say anything when he saw it. He just nodded once, and Carson smiled for the first time. Rex stood watch, late that night. His eyes were tired, but his ears were sharp. He listened to the wind, and then he lay down, tail curled against the barn door, content because something good was growing in the ashes, and for the first time in a long time, no one was running anymore. By the time January arrived, the Holloway Refuge no longer felt like a hidden corner of Colorado. Snow blanketed the hills, but trucks still came in almost daily. Off-road rigs from neighboring counties, muddy sedans with military plates, vans filled with old canine handlers and new volunteers alike. The land that once held only a barn, a few kennels and a half-healed dog had grown into something more. It pulsed with purpose now, like a living artery of something bigger than any one man or mission. Inside the main building, Emma adjusted the projector as more people filed into the common room. Folding chairs scraped against the wooden floor. When the award was finally placed over Rex's broad neck, the room stood. No applause, just silence. A silence filled with understanding. Rex didn't seem to notice the medal, but he leaned against Dan's leg and stayed there. After the ceremony, in one of the side chambers, Emma was pulled aside by a woman in a dark green uniform, U.S. Public Health Service. She returned 20 minutes later, her face pale, eyes wet. "They're giving me a research grant," she said softly, "for PTSD in veterans and trauma response in working dogs." Dan blinked. "Really?" Emma nodded. "They want me to build a program, use what we've learned from Rex, from Keene, from the whole damn story." Joe clapped her shoulder. It's about time. That night, they returned to Colorado. The welcome home was quiet. There were no parades, just headlights from parked trucks along the dirt road, bonfires lit near the barn, and men and women in coats raising coffee cups and thermoses as the group returned. Someone strung a banner between two trees. "Welcome home, Rex." Dan parked the SUV and opened the rear door. Rex hopped down carefully. He stood there for a moment, snow swirling around his legs. Then he walked forward, straight through the circle of waiting people, and sat in front of the flagpole they had raised the week before. Someone played a song on a guitar, quiet, unpolished, a tune Dan recognized from boot camp. Later, by the fire, Emma sat beside him, leaning into his side as Rex slept with his head across her lap. "Feels different now," she said. Dan nodded. "It is." Joe joined them, holding a folded letter. "From Keene," he said. Dan took it, read it slowly. "They'll never say it outright. But we started something. The hearings are getting deeper. Whistleblowers keep coming forward. You were right not to run. People want more than rage. They want reason. And Rex, he showed them what loyalty looks like." Dan stared at the letter a long time, then burned it in the fire. "Let the truth stay with the ones who earned it," he said. By the end of the week, they'd already received a dozen requests from agencies across the country asking about the sanctuary. Some wanted training tips, others wanted to model programs, a few just wanted to know how to start healing. Emma began drafting curriculum. Joe took over structural improvements. Dan expanded the kennels. Rex, he kept sleeping near the door, and every so often, when the wind changed, he would lift his head and stare into the woods, as if remembering something that had almost been lost. A threat buried, a bond that saved a man's life, and the mission that still wasn't over, because there were more men out there, more ghosts like Alex Keene, and Rex, even in retirement, was still waiting for the next one to come home. The first snowfall of December coated Pine Bluff like a soft blanket, muting the world and slowing everything to a crawl. The trees stood heavy with white, the roads disappeared under layers of powder, and the usual buzz of chainsaws or engines around the Holloway refuge was replaced by the quiet crunch of boots and paws moving through the yard. Dan Rourke stood outside the main barn, watching his breath cloud in front of him, one hand resting gently on Rex's harness. The dog had grown slower these past few weeks. The wound from the sniper's bullet had mostly healed, but cold weather stiffened his legs, and he often lay down by the fireplace long before dinner. But whenever Dan opened the barn door, Rex would still push himself up and follow, tail flicking with effort, his body moving like a soldier refusing to leave the field. Inside, Emma and Joe were setting up folding chairs. The big meeting table had been cleared to make space. A pot of strong coffee steamed in the corner, and a file folder lay open in front of Joe. The man they were meeting had once been on Langley's kill team. Now he was here, alone, unarmed, and 2 hours early. His name was Carson Rudd. He sat across from Dan, palms open, eyes steady. No twitching, no false bravado. Just the quiet confidence of someone who had already made peace with whatever came next. "I didn't come for a deal," he said. Joe nodded slowly. "You sure picked a strange place to prove it." Carson looked down at the folder Emma had prepared. His service record, the missions he'd led, the private security firm he'd once represented. "I'm not proud of what I did," he said, "but I did it. Hearings were called, oversight committees reformed, whistleblowers came forward. One by one the ghosts stepped out of the dark. Dan returned to the farm with Rex. Emma moved in the next week, and Joe turned down a promotion with Homeland to help build what Dan had only dreamed of before. A sanctuary, not just for dogs, but for soldiers. The broken, the forgotten, the ones still learning how to stand again. They called it the Holloway Refuge, in honor of the medic who'd saved both Dan and Joe in Fallujah, long gone, but never forgotten. Rex became its first official resident and its soul. One evening a letter arrived. No return address. Inside was a photo, Keene smiling faintly beside a small therapy group of veterans in protective custody. On the back, one sentence: "Still standing. Dan placed it on the mantel, beside a medal, a leash and a worn military patch that read, K9 Unit, No Man Left Behind. Outside, a new puppy barked in the distance, and Rex, older now, lifted his head and listened. The mission wasn't over, but it had changed, and this time it was built on redemption. The sky over Pine Bluff turned a warm amber as late autumn rolled in, washing the valley in golden light and long, soft shadows. The leaves had begun to fall, crisp underfoot, swirling in lazy arcs along the dirt road that led up to Dan Rourke's property. The chaos of the past weeks had settled into something quieter. Not peace exactly, but something close enough that people could breathe again. The barn was no longer just a training yard. It had become a gathering place, a center for something that grew out of fire and fear and pain. Emma stood by the fence, clipboard in hand, watching two veterans gently guide a pair of young dogs through basic commands. Both men had the look of those who had once been broken and were now learning how to be whole again. Backs a little straighter, eyes a little clearer, voices just a little steadier. Dan leaned against the barn door, arms folded, watching it all. "Unfold. They're good," he said. Emma glanced over. "They're healing." Joe walked up behind them, carrying a wooden sign in his arms. Burned into the cedar was a single name, Keen's Corner. Below it, in smaller letters, "For those who chose to keep standing." They mounted it just outside the barn, beside the gate, where Rex often lay, stretched out under the sun, eyes half closed, but ears always alert. "Feels right," Dan said, brushing the sawdust from the frame. Emma smiled. "He gave people more than just a story. He gave them proof that you can come back, even after everything," Joe added. Word about the sanctuary had spread farther than they expected. News crews didn't come. They weren't invited. But veterans came, officers, retired handlers, even a few civilian therapists who'd heard about the place from word of mouth and decided to help. One woman, a quiet psychologist from Fort Carson, brought her service dog and sat for hours with a young vet who hadn't spoken in days. When the man finally whispered a few words, it wasn't to her, but to the dog. It was enough. Dan watched from the porch that night as more trucks pulled into the driveway. Volunteers, donors, friends, and all of it had started with a dog that wouldn't stop barking at a closed door. Inside the barn, Rex had been given a proper bed. The old army blanket was still there, but now there were medical pads, supplements, a cooling mat for his hips. He was getting older, slower. But when the new pups acted up, one growl from Rex straightened them right out. He still trained every morning, still watched over the fence line, still sat by the door at sundown, as if waiting for someone to return. Dan often joined him there. They would sit in silence for an hour or more, watching the trees shift with the wind. "Think he'll come back?" Emma asked one evening, sitting beside them. Dan didn't look away from the horizon. "He already has, in every man that walks through that gate." She leaned her head on his shoulder. They didn't need to say more. A few weeks later, Dan received a letter. It was handwritten. No stamp, no return address. Just a single sheet of paper. "The hearings are starting next week. They're letting me testify in person. No cage, no escort, just my voice. Tell Rex he was right about me." Dan read it 3 times, then folded it gently and placed it in the drawer beneath the barn's first aid kit. That night, Rex sat a little closer than usual. By mid-November, the barn was full most nights. Veterans stayed late, some sleeping in bunks Dan and Joe had built. Emma coordinated schedules for therapy sessions. A woman named Camille, who had served as a combat nurse in Afghanistan, took over feeding duty for the animals. She was quiet, scarred, but smiled every time Rex nudged her arm with his nose. "You think we can really do this?" she asked Dan one night, wiping her hands on her jeans after setting down bowls for the dogs. "Do what?" "Turn a place like this into something that lasts." Dan looked around the barn, at the quiet men brushing dogs, at the fire crackling. in the metal drum, at the warmth in the air despite the cold outside. It already has. On Veterans Day, they held a small ceremony, no speeches, no cameras, just a flag raised over the yard. Alex Keene's name was etched into a wooden plank on the wall. Below the words, "We remember the ones they tried to forget." Dan stood with Emma, and Joe, watching the flag catch the breeze. Rex sat at Dan's heel. Someone in the group began to hum a tune, an old army cadence, and the others slowly joined in. Voices low, worn, some cracking with emotion. It wasn't about patriotism, it was about pain, about healing, about remembering that even the forgotten deserve to come home. After the ceremony, a boy approached Dan, maybe 12, skinny, shy. "Her dad served," he said. "He doesn't talk about it, but he smiles when he sees Rex in the videos." Dan knelt. "He's welcome here any time." The boy nodded and handed Dan a drawing, crude pencil work but detailed. A man standing beside, a dog, both facing the sunrise. The words beneath it read, "You kept watch. So now we will." Dan swallowed hard and put a hand on the boy's shoulder. "Tell your dad thanks," he said, "and tell him the gate's open." That night, Dan stood on the porch again. Rex was slower getting up the steps. Dan sat beside him, feeling the dog's warm body pressed gently against his side. The stars were out. A new wind moved through the trees. No enemies tonight, no ghosts in the dark, just the promise of something better. And for the first time in a long while, Dan believed it would last. The wind over Washington carried a sharp edge that morning, slicing between the marble pillars of old buildings and brushing across the Potomac with a cold breath that warned winter was coming. Dan Rourke stepped out of the black SUV with the stiffness of a man unused to wearing anything but denim and flannel. His dark suit itched under the wool coat, but it fit well, tailored by a veterans organization that insisted he, at least, look the part. He adjusted his tie awkwardly, looking over at Emma. She looked the same way she always did, poised, calm, precise. But today she wore a navy blue blazer with a silver pin on the lapel in the shape of a caduceus, the symbol of healing. Joe walked behind them, suit sleeves rolled slightly, necktie loose. And Rex stood tall, despite the grey in his muzzle, wearing a harness with the words "Service" stitched in faded red. The Capitol steps stretched ahead of them, wide and clean and symbolic. Dan never much cared for ceremony, but this time he understood its purpose. Not for him, not for ego, but because people needed to see the truth standing in daylight for once. Inside, the rotunda was quiet, but filled with weight. Cameras flashed, reporters murmured behind velvet ropes, and military officers lined the rear walls in silent formation. A small stage had been erected beneath the dome, flanked by flags and guarded by 2 Marines in dress blues. Dan didn't want to be here, but Alex Keene had asked him to come, not for Alex's sake, for Rex. The medal was called the K9 Medal of Valor. It wasn't often awarded, and never before posthumously, but Rex was alive. Barely. The bullet wound he'd taken weeks earlier was healing, but slowly. The limp in his front leg was permanent now. Emma said he'd adapt. Dan wasn't so sure. The citation was read by the president's press secretary, a list of acts of loyalty, instinct, courage, and sacrifice. They made it sound clean, easy, as though the dog's unwavering presence had simply helped facilitate the recovery of a high-risk subject. But Dan remembered the blood, the barking, the desperate way Rex had fought to return to that hospital room, how he'd stopped breathing. For 10 seconds in the back of Dan's truck, sensing the quiet shift in the air. They hadn't won the war, but they had survived the ambush, and for now, that was enough. The morning after the confrontation was grey and still. A cold wind pushed through the trees like a sigh from something ancient, and the snow no longer looked pure. Trampled now, broken, but the ranger station remained standing, the smoke from its chimney curling gently into the pale sky. Inside, the silence was different, not tense, not fearful. It was the silence that came after the storm, when those left behind weren't sure what to say yet. Alex Keene sat at the table, a cup of coffee between his hands. He hadn't touched it. Across from him, Dan leaned back in the creaking wooden chair, arms crossed, watching the man the government had tried to bury alive. Emma moved between them, cleaning dried blood from the side of Keene's head with quiet hands, like she'd done 1,000 times in the field for soldiers who didn't remember their own names. Keene finally broke the silence. He's gone, isn't he? Langley? Dan nodded. Off the grid, no official record of his visit. His men withdrew before federal units got here. Keene let out a hollow laugh. That's how it works. Always ghosts cleaning up ghosts. Joe entered from the back room, with a tablet in hand. Not this time. He set the device on the table. Footage played, grainy but clear. Langley's voice, Langley's orders, Langley stepping into the fire of his own lies. Emma had uploaded the stream to every platform, sent it to 4 independent reporters, and mirrored it across anonymous archives. The truth wasn't a secret anymore. It was public. Keene stared at the screen, watching himself speak, hearing the weight in his own voice that he hadn't recognized in years. "I remember that moment," he said. "The way Rex looked at me, like I was still a person." Dan didn't respond. He didn't need to. Keene reached down, running a hand over Rex's fur. "They wanted to erase me. Thought they could shut me down with chemicals and lies." He looked up at Dan. "But you came back." Dan leaned forward. "You deserved the chance they stole from you." "I don't know what I deserve," Keene whispered. "I remember things I did, people I hurt." Emma stepped in then, quiet but firm. "They made you into a weapon. You were never given a choice." Keene's jaw tightened. "But I have one now." That afternoon, federal agents arrived, not in black vans or helicopters, but quietly in unmarked cars, respectful and methodical. A woman in a brown coat introduced herself as Agent Whitaker. She didn't flash a badge. She didn't ask for Dan's cooperation. She already knew she had it. "I've seen the footage," she said, standing beside the fire with Emma and Joe. "This is going to make waves." Dan stood across from her, arms folded. "That's the point." Whitaker nodded. "I don't think Langley will show up again, but his contractors, the project itself, it won't vanish overnight." "No," Dan said, "but now it can't." "Hide." She turned toward Keene, who was sitting on the porch, Rex at his side. "What does he want to do?" "Turn himself in," Dan replied. Whitaker raised an eyebrow. "He wants people to know what happened, all of it. From inside the program, what he remembers, what he did, what was done to him." Whitaker took a breath. "We can work with that. Testimony like his, with supporting evidence, it's invaluable. And dangerous," Joe added. "There'll be people who don't want this story told." "There always are," Whitaker said. "But it's already out. The only way they win now is if he runs." Dan looked out at Keene. "He's not running anymore." They drove him to Denver that evening. Keene insisted on walking into the federal office under his own power, unshackled. A free man choosing accountability over hiding. It wasn't an arrest. It was a reckoning. Before stepping through the doors, he turned to Dan. "You think this matters?" he asked. Dan didn't hesitate. "It matters because you're still standing." Keene nodded slowly, then looked down at Rex. "Thank you, old friend." Rex licked his hand once, then watched as Keene stepped inside. The news broke fast, not just Langley's footage, but Keene's testimony, a whistleblower in every sense, a man who had been used, buried, and reawakened. His face appeared on screens across the country, not as a monster, not as a rogue operative, but as a broken man trying to make things right. Public pressure followed. Joe intercepted a scrambled transmission from a military satellite feed. The encryption was government-grade, but the call wasn't logged in any public database. Langley, he'd activated the Omega Protocol, a sanctioned cleanup operation reserved For top-tier experimental failures, when an asset couldn't be recovered, couldn't be controlled, it was terminated, along with anyone who stood too close. Kill teams already moving, Joe said, staring at the data. 12-man unit, no insignia. They're not coming to negotiate. Emma sat at the table, her hands clenched. How much time? Joe checked. The logs. Maybe an hour. Dan didn't move. Then we don't run, he said. Emma looked up. You want to fight them? No, Dan said. I want them to expose themselves. They didn't have much. 2 rifles, a scoped AR-15. 1 hunting shotgun, and Rex Keene, still recovering, insisted on helping. You're not ready, Dan warned. Keene just nodded at the IV in his arm. They took everything from me. If I die, now I die standing. Emma set up the camera rig in the back room. 3 feeds, 1 uplink, connected to 3 journalists with the courage to broadcast without approval. Everything that happened in the next few hours would be streamed, archived, and made public. It was their only insurance. The snow thickened. Dusk rolled in early. Rex moved between the trees, placing scent markers, retracing familiar trails. He knew the terrain better than anyone. They trusted him to guide them when the shooting started. Langley didn't arrive with sirens or fury. He came in silence. 2 black SUVs, 1 unmarked chopper, 12 soldiers in winter gear, moving through the trees with military precision. Dan spotted them from the eastern ridge, scoped rifle braced against a fallen log. Target acquisition confirmed, Joe whispered through the comm. They're splitting into 3 teams. No logos, no hesitation. Dan gave the signal. Emma hit record. The first shot didn't come from them. It came from Langley's team. Suppressed rifle fire, 2 rounds slamming into the ranger station's wooden wall. Joe returned fire from the roof, grazing one of the infiltrators. Rex darted forward, disappearing into the brush. Keene crouched behind the outer fuel shed, gritted his teeth as he steadied his weapon. More gunfire. Controlled, calculated, no screams. No panic. They weren't amateurs. Langley stepped into the clearing like a man inspecting a garden, calm, unhurried. Dan saw him through the scope. Could have taken the shot. Didn't. Not yet. Langley looked toward the station and called out, "Alex!" His voice was loud, clear, cutting through the snow. "You're sick, you know it. I can help you." From the shed, Keene stood slowly. "Help me?" His voice cracked. "You turned me into a ghost." Langley took a step forward. "You were already broken. I gave you purpose." "No," Keene said. "You gave me orders. Then you tried to erase me." Dan watched Langley's hand dip toward his belt. Then Rex charged. The dog shot out of the woods like lightning, leaping at the sniper hidden on the ridge. The man didn't even scream, just fell backward, rifle tumbling. That broke the formation. Gunfire erupted again, louder, wilder now. Joe dropped one from the rooftop. Dan took another through the thigh. The unit began to fall back, but Langley held his ground, eyes on Keene. "You won't shoot me," he said. "You don't have it in you." Keene raised the rifle. "I did once," he said quietly. "I won't miss this time." But he didn't shoot. Dan stepped forward instead. "You wanted a weapon," Dan said, lowering his own rifle. "You created one, but you forgot something." Langley blinked. Dan pointed at Rex. "You forgot what loyalty really looks like." Langley turned, too late. Emma was behind him. She held no gun, just a phone. Streaming live to thousands. Langley froze as realization hit. His voice, his actions, all captured, all broadcast. The retreat came fast. The unit pulled back. Langley, cornered, didn't speak, just stood there, silence finally catching up with him. Dan didn't need to shoot, because the truth had done the job better. Later that night, Keene sat beside the fire, Rex's head resting on his lap. Emma uploaded the final footage, unedited. The program was exposed. Langley would vanish, but the lie would not survive. Dan sat outside, the cold biting at his skin. Rex lifted his head. Joe followed, rifle ready, eyes sharp. Behind them, Rex led the way, tail low, ears high, nose pressed to the wet floor. They had followed the trail from the old motel. Prints, scattered debris, the broken grate. Subject K was no longer a ghost. He was running, and bleeding, and afraid, but not alone. Dan's foot landed on something soft, a scrap of fabric. Military issue. Emma's voice crackled through the earpiece. I'm watching the feeds from the north perimeter. No Langley units yet. You're clear. For now, they pressed forward. 10 minutes in, the tunnel narrowed into a chamber where the wall had collapsed, forming a small pocket of space. Rex stopped, nose in the air. Then he sat. Dan shined the light into the gap. A man crouched in the corner, hair matted, skin pale and streaked with dried blood, eyes wide but empty. Alex Keene. Dan didn't move, didn't speak, just lowered the flashlight and let the darkness wrap around them. Rex stepped forward and lay down beside Keene, his head resting near the man's leg. Keene didn't flinch. Instead, his hand moved, slow, trembling, until it touched Rex's. Fur, I remember this dog, he whispered. He never left my side. Dan crouched beside him, and neither did we. Keene looked up, eyes finally meeting Dan's. They put something inside me, he said, voice hollow. A switch, a fuse. I wake up, and I don't know what I've done. Joe stepped forward. We know. That's why we came. Keene shook his head. You shouldn't have. Dan placed a hand on his shoulder. Too late. They didn't make it out the way they came. Langley's men were already closing in, 4 vehicles converging on the northern exits. Emma's voice came fast and sharp. They're sweeping block by block. You've got 10 minutes tops. Keene stood on shaky legs, supported by Dan. Rex moved ahead again, limping slightly but focused. They surfaced in a maintenance shaft near the train depot, forgotten and rusted, hidden behind old shipping containers. Joe opened the grate while Dan and Keene moved up, one step at a time. Outside, the cold bit through their clothes, and the sound of helicopters cut the sky like a knife. Langley wasn't coming quietly. They didn't go back to the barn. Too risky. Instead, they headed for the old ranger station they'd used before, Emma waiting with blankets, painkillers, and silence. She didn't ask questions, just wrapped Keene in warmth and helped him lie down. He's not stable, she whispered to Dan later. He's not dangerous, but he's frayed, like a man who doesn't know which memories are real anymore. Dan watched him sleep. No one could survive what he did and stay whole. That night, Langley went public, a leak, a press release, a warning. Subject K was a threat, a danger to public safety, a rogue soldier, no names, no context. Just a ghost story turned cautionary tale. Dan watched the report in silence. Emma snapped the TV off. Joe muttered, he's building the kill order, making the public fear him before they even know him. Dan turned to Rex, who was curled near Keene's bed again. They want to paint him as a monster. Emma stepped beside him. Then we show them the truth. The next move wasn't going to be escape. It was going to be exposure. They didn't just want to save Keene. They wanted to end the program that created him. They wanted the world to see what Langley had done, and they were running out of time. The snow began to fall early, just after dawn. Fine. Powdery flakes drifted from the grey sky, settling on the pine branches that lined the edge of the ranger station. Dan watched from the window, coffee in hand, Rex curled near his feet. The quiet was deceptive, too calm, too still. The kind of silence that always came before something violent. Behind him, Alex Keene stirred in the cot. He hadn't slept more than a few hours at a time. His eyes still carried that vacant distance, but each time he woke, there was more of him present. He recognized Emma now, recalled Joe. He even remembered the old ranger cabin, said he'd stayed there once during survival training. But it was Rex who kept him grounded. Whenever the confusion overwhelmed him, it was the dog's steady gaze that pulled him back. He's stabilizing, Emma whispered beside Dan. But he's not safe. Not yet. Dan didn't answer, because he knew. Something was coming, and it was going to tear through them like a storm. That afternoon, Joe had chosen the motel, a cheap roadside place 10 miles outside of Glenmore, because it had bad lighting, no cameras, and a back entrance that overlooked a ravine. The perfect place for a quiet conversation. Or an ambush. Dan and Keane took a single room, lights off, curtains closed. Rex waited at the corner of the lot, half hidden behind a truck, eyes scanning every shadow. Langley arrived on time. No backup, no weapon drawn, just a black car, a polished coat, and that cold confidence that had made Dan's skin crawl from the first moment. He entered the room without knocking. "You called." Dan stayed seated. "We have something you want." Langley smiled. "I doubt that." Then he saw Keane. The smile vanished. Langley took a step closer. "He shouldn't be awake." "He is," Dan said, "and he remembers." Keane stood slowly. "You told me I was broken, that I needed fixing. You lied." Langley didn't blink. "You were a liability." "You still are." "No," Keane said. "I'm proof." Langley's tone shifted. "You're a weapon. You always were." Keane looked at Rex, then back at Langley. "Not anymore." Langley turned toward Dan. "You think you've done something noble here? All you've done is wake up a project we spent years trying to bury." Dan leaned forward. "That's the idea." Outside, a click echoed softly through the lot. Rex moved. He darted from behind the truck toward the far building and took down a man trying to scale the roof. The fight exploded in an instant. Emma's voice cracked through the earpiece. "They're here. 2 units approaching fast, north side and alley." Joe opened fire from the balcony, dropping the first attacker before the second reached cover. Glass shattered. Sirens wailed in the distance, ones Dan had triggered remotely. Through Emma's hacked dispatch network, Langley tried to run, but Keane caught him by the collar and slammed him against the wall. "Do it!" Langley hissed. "Prove you're still what I made." Keane's fist clenched, then relaxed. He stepped back. "No," he said, "that's not me anymore." Langley's eyes narrowed. Keane turned to Dan. "Let him go." Dan hesitated, then nodded. Langley slipped, out the door into the chaos beyond. Sirens grew louder. The kill team vanished into the trees. Joe reloaded. "That was loud." Dan helped Keane sit down. "That was enough." Within the hour, footage from the motel had gone viral. Emma had streamed. Parts of the confrontation lived from a planted body cam on Joe's vest, Langley's face, his voice, his threats. They were all out now. He wasn't just a rumor anymore. He was exposed. Later that night, they regrouped at the outpost, Rex curled beside Keane, both of them too exhausted to move. Dan stood at the doorway, watching the trees. Joe poured a drink and said, "It's not over." "No," Dan agreed, "but now the world's watching." And far away, in a bunker with alarms still blinking, the Langley group began deleting files that never officially existed. They were no longer cleaning up a mess. They were running from it. The old wood creaked beneath Dan's boots as he paced. The outpost floor, listening to the faint static from the comms unit. The last 48 hours had stripped the calm from their lives, Langley's ambush, the motel trap, the fallout. And now, with Subject K's true identity finally confirmed. As Alex Keane, they weren't just witnesses anymore. They were accomplices in something the government had tried to bury so deep it nearly erased a man's soul. Rex, still stitched and sore, lay in the center of the room, head lifted, eyes watching every move Dan made. He hadn't taken his gaze off the east window all morning, like he was waiting for something only he could sense. Emma appeared from the back room with fresh printouts, logs, memos, fragments of conversations. "They're trying to scrub him again," she said, laying the papers on the table. "Not just his identity, everything, as if Alex Keane never existed." Joe leaned over the files, his expression darkening. "That's not erasure. That's extermination prep. They're getting ready to kill him." Officially or not, Dan stopped pacing. "We have to find him before they do." They didn't need to ask how. Rex already knew. The storm drain smelled like mold and rust. Water dripped from overhead grates, echoing through the narrow concrete tunnels like distant footsteps. Dan moved slowly, flashlight low, the beam cutting through the dark like a blade. Body drawn tight like a bowstring. When they reached the outer fence, Dan froze. There were voices. 2 men, guards, moving near the intake tunnel. Not government, not military. 2 casual in posture, but armed. Joe raised 2 fingers. Dan nodded. It was over in seconds. Silenced. Quick. No time for guilt. They moved deeper into the underbelly of the compound. The tunnel was colder than expected, the air metallic, dense with recycled oxygen and secrets too old to forget. They reached a reinforced door. Joe bypassed the security with a cracked key code Emma had fed them from the server back at the cabin. Inside was a corridor lined with dim red lights and flickering cameras. The silence was alive, humming, close. Then they heard it. A voice, soft, familiar. I remember your face. Dan stepped forward slowly. A figure stood at the far end of the hall, hands unshackled, wearing loose tactical fabric, eyes bloodshot, jaw tight. Alex Keene. He wasn't restrained. He wasn't unconscious. He was awake, and he was waiting. Rex let out a low, sharp bark and ran ahead, stopping just short of Keene. Keene didn't move. He stared down at the dog, then he knelt. His hands trembled as he touched Rex's fur. I remember you, he whispered. You were mine. Dan stepped beside him. They tried to take that from you. Keene looked up, hollow and aware. They took everything, Dan crouched. We're here to get you out before they kill you. Keene shook his head slowly. They're already here. An explosion rocked the far end of the corridor. The kill team had arrived. Emma's voice came through. The radio sharp and fast. They breached the west gate. You have maybe 5 minutes max. Joe scanned the hallway. We'll never outrun them in these tunnels. Keene stood. His voice was clearer now. Stronger. There's another way. Dan looked at him. You. Sure, Keene nodded. I built it. The air inside the escape shaft was tight, filled with rust, sweat, and the electric scent of charged fear. Alex Keene moved with precision through the narrow corridor, the kind of fluid motion that only came from deep muscle memory. He wasn't guessing his way forward. He remembered every turn, every blind curve, every hatch they'd welded shut. They hadn't planned for anyone to ever use this route again. That was the point. But Alex had buried the map in his bones. Dan followed close, rifle slung over his shoulder, Rex at his heel, and Joe bringing up the rear with a sat phone strapped to his chest, feeding live updates to Emma. Emma, who was now operating out of a van disguised as a utility rig, parked half a mile from the compound. She was watching satellite feeds and bouncing comms across half a dozen encrypted networks, doing what she could to keep Langley's team in the dark, at least for a little while longer. Keene reached a rusted panel and slammed his palm against the side. A hiss of air, a creak of metal, and the door opened outward into a ventilation bay thick with steam. He stepped out and waited. His hands were shaking slightly, but his eyes were still, clear in a way they hadn't been before. They'll be sweeping the main tunnel, Keene said. We'll use the boiler path. They never mapped it. Too old, too unstable. Joe grunted. Perfect, just how I like it. Dan kept his voice low. You're sure about this? Keene nodded once. I didn't forget what they did to me. I just didn't know it had a name until now. The corridor beyond the boiler room was pitch black and slick with condensation. Pipes hissed. The floor groaned. Rex moved carefully, leading the way as if he too could see the shape of things through the dark. They emerged near the outer security wall 20 minutes later, mud-covered, out of breath, alive. But they weren't finished. This wasn't an escape, it was bait. Back at the outpost, Emma uploaded the redacted medical files onto 3 independent news servers, each with delayed triggers. They wouldn't post yet. Not unless she failed to input a 24-hour reset code. It was insurance. If Langley killed them, the world would find out what the Langley group had done. What Project Thalassa had really been. Emma looked over her shoulder, heart pounding, and whispered into the mic, "You have 20 minutes before reinforcements sweep that whole sector. That's the window." The plan had always been risky. Expose. Langley catch him off guard. Force a confrontation that couldn't be denied. He remembered a dog with eyes full of loyalty, and for the first time in years, he remembered his own name. The wind slammed hard against the trees outside the outpost, bending branches and shaking the old rafters, like nature itself was warning them to leave, but inside the air was still. Too still. Dan stood at the window with his arms crossed, eyes scanning the woods like he could feel something watching. Rex lay near the door, body tense, unmoving. The dog hadn't slept more than an hour since the warning about the kill team. He barely blinked. His instincts were turned up so high, Dan could feel it radiating from him like heat off concrete. Joe hadn't spoken much since breakfast. He was working through intel, updating the floor plans of the underground facility where Alex Keene was, likely being held. The tunnel system beneath it ran deeper than they thought, connecting to an old rail access buried under decades of forest growth. It was a perfect ghost nest, quiet, cold, unreachable. Until now. Emma burst through the side door with a flash drive clutched in her fist, her hair soaked from the storm and her voice ragged. "He's here." Dan turned. "Who?" "Langley." Joe stood up. "What do you mean?" Emma dropped the flash drive onto the table and pulled up a video feed. Hospital security footage. This was yesterday. He's walking the corridors like he owns the place. He's not just supervising, he's taking over. Dan leaned over her shoulder as she played the footage. Langley walked slowly, deliberately. Dressed in black, unbothered by the staff scattering in his path, he didn't look like a man running a cleanup. He looked like a man hunting. When he stopped at room 209, the door opened before he touched it. Whoever was inside was expecting him. Emma hit pause. He's not just private sector. He's something else. Joe narrowed his eyes. He's off book. No chain of command. Langley doesn't report to the government. The government reports to him when it's too late. Dan's voice was quiet. "So who does he work for?" Emma exhaled. "Whoever pays more to keep things buried." That night, the outpost's perimeter alarm triggered. No movement in the trees, no vehicles. But the sensors caught something. A drone, not military. Civilian retrofit stealth tech. Dan pulled it from the bushes 20 minutes later. Its body split from an impact with a pine trunk, but the data module was still intact. Joe opened it under. The single bare bulb in the war room. "Facial recognition scans," he said, jaw clenched. They were confirming identities. Emma leaned in. "You think Langley's team is checking for survivors?" "No," Joe said. "They're checking who they'll have to silence." Dan rubbed his temples. "He knows we're onto him. He's waiting to see if we'll make a mistake." Rex stood suddenly, eyes locked on the window. A growl formed in his throat. Dan moved to the window. Lights, 2 of them, slow, controlled, no engine noise. Electric SUVs, black and matte finished, moving like predators along the ridgeline. Emma backed away from the table. "He's here." Langley didn't knock. He stood by the truck, arms folded, eyes fixed on the outpost as if he could see through the walls. He didn't raise his voice, didn't announce himself. He waited. Dan stepped out with his rifle lowered but ready. "You're trespassing." Langley didn't flinch. "So are you." "Who are you?" Langley's smile was slight, cold. "A problem solver." Dan's grip tightened. "Solving what?" Langley took 1 step forward. "Containment. Before. Your curiosity becomes something more permanent." "You're too late," Dan said. "We know about Keene. We know what you did to him." Langley tilted his head. "No, you know what we let you find." Behind Dan, Joe stood in the doorway with his sidearm holstered but visible. "What do you want?" Langley's gaze shifted. Subject K was never supposed to wake up, but someone interfered. Someone who thought loyalty outweighed programming. His eyes landed on Rex. The implication was clear. Rex had triggered something, a memory, a fracture in the conditioning, and Langley saw it as a threat. "He's not a weapon anymore," Dan said. Langley's smile vanished. "He's exactly what we made him. You just haven't seen it yet." And then, without another word, Langley returned to his vehicle. No threats, no guns, just a promise left hanging in the air like smoke after a match. The next morning, Emma accessed a new server buried under 3 levels of encryption. "Keane was one of 5 subjects," she said, reading aloud. "He's the last. The others didn't survive re-entry." Joe scanned the data. "And now Langley's bringing in failsafes. If Keane becomes unstable, if he remembers everything, they'll shut it all down." Dan looked at the map. "Including us." Emma nodded. "We don't just need to find him now. We need to reach him before they do." That afternoon, an intercepted satellite ping showed new heat signatures near the lab. 5 men, no IDs, moving in combat formation. The kill team had arrived, and somewhere underground, behind locked steel doors and whispering vents, Alex Keane opened his eyes again. But this time he didn't see doctors or machines. He saw the shadow of a dog sitting beside his bed. Not real, not yet, but enough. He whispered 2 words into the dark: "Help me." The morning came quiet and heavy. The clouds sunk low across the Colorado peaks, like a warning draped over the land. Dan stood alone outside the outpost, watching the grey light stretch slowly across the tree line. He didn't sleep the night before. None of them had. Not with Langley's visit still crawling beneath their skin, and the kill team confirmed to be just miles away from the compound. Inside, Joe sat hunched over a map of the underground facility, marking every vent, tunnel, and access point he could find. Emma worked across from him, eyes bloodshot, lips dry from hours without speaking. The silence between them had changed. It wasn't fear anymore. It was calculation. Something brutal and necessary was taking shape between the 3 of them, and it couldn't be undone. Joe turned the tablet toward Dan as he stepped back inside. "There's a breach point here," he said, pointing to a side corridor near the fuel depot. "It's narrow and reinforced, but we can reach it on foot. If he's still in the chamber they labeled Containment Echo, that's where we'll make contact." Dan studied the schematic. "What happens if he doesn't recognize Rex? If the programming holds?" Joe didn't answer right away. His silence was answer enough. Emma closed her laptop. "I found the final report from the original Thalassa project. Not just notes, confessions. A field doc logged them before disappearing off the system. Her name was A. Nilsson. She worked directly with Subject K for over a year." She slid a printed copy of the document across the table. Dan read slowly. "Subject exhibits extreme adaptability to environmental stimuli. Base conditioning successful. Emotional recall suppressed. Autonomy diminished to subclinical range." He looked up. "They killed the part of him that made him human." Emma nodded. "That's what the sedatives were for, to bury what little was left." Joe added, "But when Rex saw him, something shifted. That's what Langley's worried about. The program wasn't built to handle memory reactivation." Dan ran a hand over his face. "They didn't train him to be loyal. They trained him to obey." "And he stopped obeying," Joe said. "Now they're scared of him." Later that afternoon, the storm finally broke open. Heavy rain pounded the cabin roof, a constant thrum that sounded like gunfire in the distance. Dan sat with Rex in the back room, checking his gear, loading magazines, running his hands across the rifle the way a man checks the weight of his regrets. "Keane trusted you," he said to the dog. "Back then, in the unit." Rex stared back, unmoving. Dan lowered his voice. "He's trying to come back, and we're not going to let them erase him again." A flash of lightning lit the room. The thunder that followed was long, rolling, deep. Joe appeared in the doorway. "We've got movement." Dan followed him outside. Emma was already at the satellite console. 2 choppers. "No markings. 15 clicks out. Inbound." Joe's jaw clenched. "Extraction or extermination?" Emma didn't blink. "They're not carrying medical kits." Dan stepped away, pulling on his coat, tightening the belt on his holster. We're going in before they do." By sundown, they reached the ridge. The compound below sat hidden under a blanket of pine, nearly invisible without thermal vision. Dan and Joe took the slope from the south, while Emma coordinated through the portable comm unit. Rex stayed at Dan's side, quiet and focused, his steps light even on wet stone. The closer they got, the more intense Rex became, ears twitching, wiped clean of any identification, and lowered his body until his chest touched the floor. Then he just lay there. That was where Dan found him minutes later, after doubling back from a side entrance. He knelt beside him, heart pounding. Then he saw it. Footprints. Fresh, mud-caked soles. Not from hospital staff. Too deep, too wide. One trail, leading away, another leading in. Dan's eyes followed the corridor, and just in time to catch the corner of a white coat turning down the west. Wing hallway, he moved, fast and silent, cutting through the storage room, looping back around. He saw the man step out of the fire exit and head for the parking lot. He wasn't alone. Behind him, barely restrained by wrist straps and a loose cloak, was Subject K. Dans. Breath caught. The man was walking, not staggering, not sedated, walking controlled, guided. The so-called doctor wasn't holding him like a patient. He was managing him like a handler would an attack dog. Dan took a photo, then slipped back through the side exit. 10 minutes later, Rex barked. Just once. A low, deep sound that made Dan's blood go cold. The truck had company. 2 hospital security. Officers were circling it, whispering into earpieces. Dan stepped forward, his hand visible, calm but firm. "That's my dog. Sir, we need you to step away from the vehicle. He's been flagged as a public risk." Dan looked down at Rex, who had lifted his head but hadn't moved. The officers didn't get the chance to act, because someone else did. A man in a black coat stepped out from between 2 ambulances. He didn't wear a badge, didn't carry a weapon, visibly, but the officers stepped aside for him. He approached the truck and looked at Dan. "I'm with federal containment." Dan didn't blink. "You don't look federal." The man's eyes were calm, almost amused. "I don't have to." "What's your name?" "Langley," the man said without hesitation. Dan felt his stomach tighten. Emma had mentioned that name once before, not a person, a shell company, a project name, a mask. "Langley," Dan repeated. "You were in room 209. I'm in a lot of rooms." "What do you want with him?" Dan asked, nodding toward Rex. Langley's gaze shifted. "To the dog. He's a liability. He's seen too much." Dan stepped between them. "So have I." There was no fight, no shouting. Langley just nodded once, like he was cataloguing the threat. Then he turned and walked away. No threats, no warnings. But Dan knew what that kind of silence meant. Something worse was coming. That night, Dan set up motion sensors around. The barn. Joe brought in weapons. Emma sealed her windows and rerouted her digital footprint through a burner network. They weren't just investigating anymore. They were targets. And Langley's silence had confirmed it. Subject K was no longer a secret. He was active, and whatever part of him the program couldn't control, whatever was left of the soldier they'd buried in chemicals and lies, it was out now and watching. At 3:14 a.m., Dan woke to the sound of Rex barking, but not from pain, not from fear. He was facing the door, tail rigid, ears pointed. Dan grabbed the shotgun and moved to the window. Headlights. One vehicle, black, parked just outside the fence. Dan reached for the latch, ready to step out. Then the engine started again. The car rolled backward, tires cutting into the gravel, and disappeared into the trees. Dan waited 10 minutes before stepping onto the porch. On the fence, tied with fishing line, was a piece of paper. One line, typed in bold letters, "He's not who you think he is," and below it, a name Dan hadn't heard in 15 years, Alex Keene. Dan froze. He didn't recognize the name, but Rex did. The dog let out a soft, broken sound, not a bark, something else, something close to mourning. The paper was still damp from the night air when Dan laid it on the barn table. One name, just one, but it was enough to shift the foundation under their feet. Alex Keane, no rank, no unit, no service record that Dan could recall from the old days. But the way Rex had reacted, it wasn't instinct, it was memory. The kind dogs never forget. The kind that meant something had happened between them, long before room 209. Emma stood across the table, her eyes moving between the name and Dan's face. I ran it through every database I have access to. Military, private, classified, nothing. The only hit came from an archived transportation manifest buried in a DoD quarantine file. Fort Buchanan, 6 years ago. Name flagged and then erased. Joe scanned the document. They tried to scrub him. Dan leaned back in the chair, arms folded. So they failed. Emma looked at him. We need to figure out who he really is. Joe stood. We need a place they can't see us while we do it. They moved operations that night. The barn, once quiet and remote, had become too exposed. Langley knew where they were. The sensors had picked up 2 vehicles the night before, both circling and leaving within minutes. Recon, pressure. Joe's contact with Homeland set them up with a temporary site, an old ranger outpost near the foothills, long since decommissioned and quietly ignored by the county. No cameras, no signals, just trees and time. Dan brought Rex in the back seat, the dog wrapped in a blanket, but watching every mile like a soldier riding back into a war zone. He wasn't limping anymore, he was waiting. By morning, they'd converted the outpost into something that felt familiar. Maps on the walls, equipment in the corners, laptops wired into deep net connections. Emma set up her workstation in the far cabin, surrounded by a fortress of coffee cups and encrypted data. Joe pinned a new layout on the corkboard, an aerial drone shot of the compound where they believed Subject K, or Alex Keane, was now being held. It's not a facility, he said. It's a lab built into a fallout shelter. No roads in, no air traffic. They use underground tunnel access, the same pattern we saw in Syria for the ghost sites. Dan studied the perimeter. What's the weak point? Joe pointed to a supply hatch on the northeast corner. Ventilation exchange. Runs hot every night around 1 a.m. Power dips slightly. Automated systems reroute energy, probably during dosage reboots. Emma turned in her seat. That's when they sedate him again? Joe nodded. Or try to. But I think it's failing. Dan's voice was low. Because he's fighting back. The next few hours were spent digging, deeper into everything they could find about Alex Keane. Emma pulled a miracle by accessing a redacted fragment of a personnel profile, misfiled under a procurement contract. He was Army, that much is clear, she said. Served under a private designation called Strike Element 9, off-the-record unit. No birth date, no family listed. But there's one scan of his psychological evaluation. She tapped the screen. It's incomplete, but the language is disturbing. Words like cognitive override, erasure threshold, and emotive deterrent triggers. They weren't training him to survive combat. They were conditioning him to become indifferent to it. Joe exhaled. They were building ghosts. Dan looked at the screen. And they left one alive. That evening, Joe set up a plan. First step, we confirm the location and make visual contact. We're not going in blind. Second, if he's still inside, we extract, but we don't use force unless necessary. We don't know how stable he is. Third, Rex leads. He's the only one he remembers. That's our chance to reach him. Emma folded her arms. What if it doesn't work? What if he sees Rex and attacks? Dan looked at her, voice steady. Then we know he's lost. Nobody said anything for a long time. That night, Dan took Rex out past the tree line and sat with him in the silence. The dog lay with his head in Dan's lap, breathing slow and steady, but his ears never stopped twitching. Dan whispered, "You knew him, didn't you? You were trained together, same unit. That's why you wouldn't leave that room. You knew what they were doing to him. Rex shifted slightly but didn't look away from the darkness. Dan closed his eyes. We're going to get him back, or end this before they use him again. Back inside the outpost, Emma cracked a secured Langley file. Joe leaned over her shoulder. What is that? Emma clicked open the final line. It's the project's endpoint protocol, she said. If Subject K wakes up fully, they send a kill team. No recovery, no witnesses. Dan stepped closer. When? Emma looked up at him. They're already en route. Outside, a storm rolled over the horizon, and from miles away, in a concrete room beneath the earth, a man named Alex Keene sat on a metal bench, his hands trembling as images flashed behind his eyes. He didn't know where he was, but he remembered pain. He remembered a cage. Dan's jaw tensed. He vanished after Baghdad, took a private contract, never spoke to anyone again. Emma spoke quietly. He's the one managing Subject K. The room fell into silence. Dan stepped back, face unreadable. Joe stood. That changes things. Dan nodded once. Yes, it does. That night, the power at Memorial went out completely. No warning, no storm, just darkness. Emergency backup lights flickered weakly to life, but several wings remained dark. The pediatric ward was locked down. ICU monitors went offline. Elevators stopped mid-floor. No alarms. No calls to local police. Inside room 209, the bed was empty. A nurse, a new hire who no one recognized, vanished during the shift change. Her car remained in the parking lot, keys still in the ignition. By morning, rumors were already spreading. A patient missing, 2 medical staff absent. No statements from administration, no reports to the press. And nobody dared ask questions. The next day, Rex was gone. Dan searched the barn twice. Nothing. No prints, no scent trail. Just an open gate and a smear of blood near the gravel path. A paw print, dragged. He hit every contact in town. Called the Pound, the local K9 unit, even the garbage routes. Finally, late that night, a call came from a woman in Glenmore, 6 miles out. She'd found a dog collapsed near her fence, bleeding, breathing shallow. A Belgian Malinois with a scar across the ear. Dan got there in 20 minutes. Rex lay in the dirt, coat matted, one leg bent wrong, ribs showing, but his eyes locked on Dan like they had that first day on base. He hadn't run away. He'd tried to return to the hospital, to room 209. Dan lifted him gently, placed him in the truck bed, and whispered promises he wasn't sure he could keep. They brought Rex home, stitched him up, and gave him painkillers. He refused to sleep. He lay by the door, eyes always toward the east, ears twitching at every sound. Joe returned just before dawn. He held a printed map and a photograph. They moved Subject K again, this time to a lab off Old Bear Ridge. It's not on any public map. It's not supposed to exist. But I found a drone pass. 2 trucks left there at midnight. One of them matched the hospital's logistics ID. Emma stared at the photo. And what's that symbol on the crate? Joe didn't answer. Dan did. Neuro-weapon signature, controlled aggression tech. Emma blinked. They're going to reawaken him, Joe added, if they haven't already. Dan's voice dropped to a whisper. Then we're almost out of time. They sat in silence as morning broke over the valley. In the quiet, Rex lifted his head, eyes fixed eastward, and far across the forest, in a compound buried beneath the trees, a man who had no name opened his eyes. And remembered fire. The fog crept low through the valley like a living thing, hiding the scars in the earth that only Dan, Joe, and Emma knew were there. They had seen the satellite images, traced the tire treads, followed the digital footprints, but all those trails ended in the same place. A compound so well buried it didn't exist on paper, nestled in the pines east of Bear Ridge. They hadn't tried to breach it. Not yet. But they knew that whatever was happening inside, it wasn't medicine, it was containment, suppression, reprogramming. Subject K wasn't just a body anymore. He was waking up, and something was beginning to stir around him. Rex hadn't left the front barn doors since returning from Glenmore. Despite the injury, despite the medication, he refused to rest. His body remained tense, his eyes alert. And Dan had started sleeping beside him, on the cold dirt floor, because Rex had never been wrong. Not once. That morning, just after sunrise, Rex stood slowly, painfully, but with purpose. Dan saw the change in him instantly. He didn't bark. He didn't whine. He walked to the truck and waited. Dan loaded him in the back and didn't ask where they were going. He just drove. They reached the edge of the hospital by mid-morning. The building loomed quiet, almost indifferent to its own secrets. A light drizzle tapped the windshield. Dan didn't approach from the main road. He parked behind the old maintenance. Lawton let Rex lead. They didn't reach room 209. Rex collapsed halfway there. But not from pain. From what was missing, room 209 was empty. The hallway was silent. Rex stared at the door, now unmarked. Emma Brooks walked down the corridor, pretending to carry a patient chart, her badge clipped at an angle to appear official. She kept her head low, but moved with confidence. She'd already memorized the staff schedule. The head nurse on duty was taking a smoke break on the roof. She had 10 minutes. The door to the medical records room clicked open, and she slipped inside. She found what she needed. Transfer logs from the last 72 hours. One entry stood out. Patient 13790K. Transfer approved by external oversight. Authority. No signature, just a stamp. Langley Group. Emma's heart dropped. She typed the name into the search database. Nothing. Not even a staff profile. Back at Dan's barn, Joe was halfway through decrypting a string of data when his expression changed. He turned the tablet toward Dan. Look at this. Movement authorization from a decommissioned site in Nevada. The facility was scrubbed last year, on paper. And in reality, Joe shook his head. Still active. They just rerouted everything through a proxy. That's where Subject K came from. Dan's eyes narrowed. What else? Joe tapped another folder. They didn't just drug him, Dan. They rewired him. He wasn't in a coma. He was sedated with a cocktail designed to suppress high-aggression neuropathways. If they stopped the doses, he could become unpredictable, violent. Dan thought of Rex barking at the hospital door. The way he positioned himself, howled, scratched, as if trying to stop something from getting out. He's waking up. Joe's voice was low. Then we've got a problem, a big one. Dan stared out into the darkness. They're going to try to cover it, lock it all down. Anyone in the way will disappear. Then we don't get in the way, Joe said grimly. We get ahead of them. Before Dan could respond, his phone buzzed. Unknown number, he answered. You're asking the wrong questions, the voice said, cold and deliberate. Dan froze. Who is this? But the line had already gone dead. He looked at Joe. They know. We're digging. Joe stood, shoulders squared. Then it's time to dig deeper. Dan looked to the barn's far wall where Rex, still weak from stress, lay curled near the door. He lifted his head, ears twitching toward the wind. Something was coming, and it wasn't friendly. A cold drizzle fell across the Colorado hills, misting the trees and muting the colors of the morning as Dan sat on the barn's back steps. Rex rested beside him, ribs faintly visible through his fur, but his eyes sharp, alert. The dog hadn't let his guard down once since room 209. Not for food, not for comfort. Something inside him stayed locked on that place, and Dan couldn't shake the feeling that Rex was warning them in the only way he knew how. Joe stood a few feet away, hands buried in his coat pockets, watching the horizon with a soldier's stillness. The files they'd uncovered the night before had cracked open a truth that made Dan's skin crawl. Subject K wasn't just a mistake. He was a weapon, built, tested, and then hidden in plain sight. Now that weapon was off the grid, and no. One in charge was talking. Dan's phone buzzed again. Emma, she spoke fast. We've got a problem. They suspended me. Dan's grip tightened. Why? I pulled patient logs. Someone flagged my access. Now I'm officially under review. Security escorted me out. You okay? For now. But they're watching. I think I triggered something. Dan ended the call and looked at Joe. It's starting. Then we need to finish first. They spent the rest of the day setting up their makeshift command center in the barn. Joe wired in secure communications, satellite-based, untraceable. Emma, operating from a burner phone and a laptop inside her apartment, began cross-referencing staff rotations, logs, and patient records. Within hours, patterns emerged. The same 3 doctors had access to Subject K at all times. They weren't on the public staff registry. No medical records, no university affiliations, nothing, just names or aliases. Joe connected the dots quickly. Private sector, contractors, not government, not exactly. Langley Group isn't federal. They're a shell, hired by other shells. Their specialty, human experimentation on combat personnel. All off books, no oversight, no accountability. Dan's jaw clenched. So they're still running the program. Joe gave a grim nod. And Subject K's escape, if that's what this is, could burn their entire operation. Dan looked at Rex. The dog hadn't moved. But when the wind shifted, Rex's ears snapped upright, gaze locked east toward town. That afternoon, Dan drove out to a feed store near the edge of town under the guise of restocking supplies. The Clark Tom was a retired Air Force mechanic who'd served with Dan's cousin. They shook hands in the back, and Dan kept his voice low. "I need some eyes on Memorial. You hear anything strange? Late-night deliveries, weird vehicles? You call me." Tom nodded once. No questions asked. They did the same at the gas station, the hardware store, even the public library. Within 48 hours, Dan had a quiet network forming. Veterans, off-duty EMTs, night shift janitors. People who didn't ask much but paid close attention. People like him. Meanwhile, Emma kept feeding them intel, surveillance footage, timestamp, anomalies. And one particularly disturbing clip. It showed Subject K. He wasn't unconscious. At least not entirely. At 4:12 a.m. the footage showed him opening his eyes, only for a moment, just enough to prove he was aware. Then the video cut. To black, no warning, no error. They edited it, Emma whispered. They know he's waking up, and they're hiding it. Dan forwarded the footage to Joe, who analyzed it frame by frame. He's lucid, at least partially, which means whatever conditioning they used is breaking. Is that good or bad? Dan asked. Joe hesitated. Depends on what they put in his head. The next day, Rex refused to stay at the barn. He barked, whined, scratched the truck until Dan gave in and took him back to the hospital grounds. This time, they parked 2 blocks away and walked the rest of the way under cover of night. Rex led the way. Not pulling, not charging. Just a guiding. He stopped at a patch of grass behind the east wing. There were tire tracks, fresh, unmarked black treads in the soft earth, and on the wall nearby a vent hung askew. Extraction point, Joe muttered. They moved him. Dan's chest tightened. Where? But Rex was already pacing, frustrated, barking toward the trees. He was gone. Back at the barn, Joe pieced together their last known data points. They couldn't move him far, not without alerting someone. They'll keep him in containment until they figure out what to do next. Dan stared at the map spread across the table. And if they can't contain him? Joe didn't answer, but they both knew they'd kill him, and anyone who knew he ever existed. The lights at Memorial Hospital flickered just once, quick, almost unnoticeable, but Emma knew better. She'd seen that glitch before, overseas in field hospitals, when satellite comms went dark just before a blackout, and here, in the middle of a quiet Colorado town, that flicker meant one thing. Someone was getting ready to disappear something, or someone. She stood just inside the nurses. Break room, back to the vending machines. Her fingers clenched around her phone. Her badge had already been revoked. The moment she swiped through the west entrance earlier that afternoon, security was waiting. No explanation, no warnings, just a cold escort to the HR office and a signature on a suspension notice. Violation of patient privacy protocols, they claimed, but the truth hung like fog in her mind. They knew she'd seen the footage, and now she was the next liability. Emma didn't go home. She went straight to Dan's barn. She didn't need to knock. The barn door rolled open before she reached it. Joe stood there, holding a receiver in one hand and a folder in the other. His face was pale, but not from fear. He was angry, coiled tight. "They're moving fast," he said, gesturing her. "Inside, we lost access to half the servers we were pinging. Whatever was keeping Subject K local, it's unraveling." Emma didn't sit. "They came after me, shut me out. Security knew my name the moment I stepped in. They're watching everything." Dan entered from the side room, drying his hands with a rag. "Did you grab anything before they cut you off?" Emma nodded and pulled a flash drive from her jacket. "Only partial logs, but I downloaded a trace. It tracks the personnel who entered room 209. There's one name that kept popping up 17 times in the past week." She handed it to Joe. He plugged it into the console. The name blinked on screen. Dr. Alan Rourke. Dan froze. "No." Emma looked up. "He's family?" "My brother." Joe turned in his seat. "Wasn't he with DARPA? I thought he retired." "Because it's logged multiple maintenance and supply entries in the last 3 days." Dan leaned in. "Who's going in?" Emma zoomed in on a clip from 2 nights earlier. The timestamp read 03:17 a.m. A stretcher was wheeled in by 2 men. No hospital badges, no standard medical attire. Black cargo jackets, military boots. "They're not hospital staff," she said. The man on the stretcher was strapped down, his face partially covered by an oxygen mask. He didn't move. But what caught Dan's attention was the name on the intake screen, Subject K. "Is this a patient?" he asked. Emma shook her head. "No file, no vitals, just a code name." "Where did they bring him from?" Emma clicked through 3 more screens. "Here, transfer paperwork from an off-site lab. Most of it's redacted, but look." She pointed at a single, unblurred phrase. "Classified military recovery operation. Operation Thalassa." Dan's stomach turned. He recognized the name. It had shown up once years ago, buried deep in a redacted after-action report from his last deployment. "A failed experimental program. No survivors listed. He's not supposed to exist," Dan muttered. "Who is he?" Emma asked. "I don't know," Dan replied, "but my dog does." They both stared at the screen in silence. Outside, the loge of the hospital continued. Indifferent to the truth hidden in its walls, Dan made his decision. "We need to find out what they're hiding in room 209, he said. "Before someone else gets hurt." Emma nodded, her face pale but resolute. "You're not alone in this, Dan. Not anymore." As they shut off the monitors and slipped back into the shadows, neither of them saw the security feed flicker to life again, this time broadcasting not from inside the hospital, but from a satellite uplink. Room 209 was no longer just a room. It was the start of a war. Dan stood in the darkened barn behind his property, the space dimly lit by a single hanging bulb that swayed gently in the breeze. Dust hung in the air like a memory that refused to settle. On the workbench lay a folder, one he hadn't opened in nearly a decade. It was military issue, worn from age, edges curled. Inside were names, contacts, lives he'd once relied on with everything he had. Men and women he'd bled with. One of those names stared up at him now. Tun Joseph Riley. Dan picked up the old field phone and dialed the number he hadn't used in years. It rang once, then silence, then a voice, deeper now but still sharp. "Rourke," Dan exhaled. "I need you." A pause. "No questions. Where?" "Hamilton County Memorial. It's not just a hospital problem." The line stayed quiet for a beat. "I'll be there by nightfall." Dan hung up. No explanations needed. That was the kind of man Joe was. By the time the sun dipped behind the mountains, a black SUV rolled into Dan's driveway, kicking up a trail of dust behind it. The door opened, and Joe stepped out. Taller than Dan remembered, broader too, but the same measured presence. A man who scanned his surroundings like he was still clearing rooms in Kandahar. Long time, Joe said. Too long. They embraced like brothers who'd survived hell and lived to count the scars. Dan didn't waste time. He laid it out. The surveillance footage, the unmarked stretcher, the falsified logs, the codename Subject K. Joe listened, jaw tightening, his arms crossed as the pieces fell into place. "The Lhasa," he murmured. "I thought that mess got buried." "You know it?" Joe nodded slowly. "I was there for the fallout. I handled a few briefings when I got pulled into Homeland. We weren't supposed to know much, but rumors said it was DARPA-linked. Behavior, modification, combat control." Dan leaned against the barn wall. "So this Subject K, he's military?" Joe nodded. "Classified. Blacker than black. If he's here, it means something went wrong." Again, Dan's voice dropped. "He's not." "Comatose, Joe. That room, it's not for treatment, it's containment." Joe's gaze narrowed. "Why move him to a public hospital?" "That's what I want to find out." Joe pulled a small black pouch from his coat and unzipped it, revealing a tablet and several USB drives. "Give me a night. I'll cross-reference the logs, see what got rerouted in the system. If they moved him through civilian infrastructure, someone left a breadcrumb." Outside, the wind picked up. The trees whispered warnings neither man wanted to hear. Inside the hospital, they made their way through the hospital's underground corridors, using Emma's badge to bypass staff-only checkpoints. No one questioned her. They all assumed she was reinstated. It was easier that way. They reached the surveillance room, a cramped, cold space behind the server hall. Emma slid into the chair and started typing, her fingers moving quickly. "Security footage is archived for 90 days. We're lucky," she said. "Room 209, here." She clicked through thumbnails, eyes narrowing. "There," she said. Dan leaned in. On the footage, a stretcher was being wheeled into room 209 in the middle of the night. 3 men in black, no insignias. The man on the gurney had no visible injuries, just an oxygen mask. His arms were strapped down tight. Emma frowned. "That's not a patient transfer. No med staff, no vitals monitoring, nothing. Can you get a better look at him?" Dan asked. She zoomed in. The image wasn't great, but the man's face was visible. Shaved head, pale, no facial hair, tubes running into his arms. "Do you know who that is?" Emma asked. "No, but I know what that look means," Dan said. "He's been under too long." Emma kept clicking. "Wait, he's listed here as John Doe. No medical history, no insurance, transferred from off-site military facility, classified." Dan's jaw tightened. "Emma," he said, "that's not a patient. That's a secret." Dan Rourke had spent most of his adult life making decisions that meant the difference between life and death. He'd called in airstrikes in remote mountains, evacuated men under gunfire, and neutralized threats before most people even noticed they were in danger. But nothing in his years of service had prepared him for the helplessness he now felt, standing in the hallway of a civilian hospital, watching his best friend chained to a kennel in a white-walled isolation room. Rex sat still, his back ramrod, straight, eyes fixed on the narrow window in the door, as if he could see through it into room 209. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. Dan had tried treats, gentle coaxing, even their old training commands. None of it worked. The dog responded only with silence, his focus absolute. Something in that room had struck deep inside him, and Dan had stopped trying to explain it away. They wanted to discharge him from the program. That's what the official letter said. Behavioral instability inconsistent with continued service, they'd written. Potential for harm to public and personnel. Bureaucratic language for, he's dangerous now, a liability, not worth the risk. Dan stood in the hospital's underground parking lot, the paper crumpled in his fist, his other hand resting absently on Rex's head. The heat of the concrete structure pressed down like a weight. A decision had to be made, and he was running out of time. "You think I'm crazy too?" he asked quietly. Rex didn't move, didn't blink. Dan knew what they were telling him. Walk away. Save your reputation. Let the dog go. But that wasn't who he was. And if Rex was right, if there really was something wrong in room 209, then someone had to find out what. He reached for his phone and scrolled through his contacts. The name was still there, buried under a dozen missed calls and half-forgotten messages. Emma Brooks, a nurse. Bright, stubborn, honest to a fault. She'd helped Dan once before, back when he trained local responders after a mass shooting. She had a sense of justice that never quite sat right with hospital politics. If anyone could help, it was her. He dialed. Dan. Her voice was cautious, tired. I need a favor, a big one. There was a pause. You're not supposed to be at the hospital. I'm not. I'm in the garage. But I need to see the surveillance archives. Another pause. Then, meet me at the staff entrance in 20. When the door creaked open, Emma was there, in grey scrubs and a badge half concealed under her jacket. Her eyes were sharp, despite the exhaustion behind them. You're lucky I still have access, she whispered, leading him down a narrow hallway. They froze my account after I spoke up last time. I'm not even supposed to be here. They passed through 2 secured doors before reaching the monitoring room. A low hum filled the space. Machines, fans, the quiet tension of secrets waiting to be uncovered. Emma moved quickly, fingers flying across the keyboard. I pulled records. On room 209, she said. It's flagged as inactive, which is odd. Just a single keypad entry lock and a sterile silence behind it. Must be nothing, said a nurse behind him. That room's been sealed off. Storage or something. It's not. Rex barked again. Then he lunged, scratching and howling, trying to tear through the metal like it was hiding something evil. Dan grabbed his harness, trying to calm him, but it was like trying to hold back a hurricane with rope. 2 orderlies appeared. One reached for Rex's collar. Don't! Rex turned and bit. The scream echoed down the hall. The chaos that followed was swift and punishing. Security, administration, a reprimand. Dan was pulled into a room and told in no uncertain terms the dog was a liability now. Dangerous, unfit for service. Dan's fists clenched beneath the table. He listened but didn't speak. Not yet, because in his gut something was screaming louder than Rex had. Something was wrong. Deeply wrong, and whatever it was hiding behind the door to room 209. The next morning, the official suspension came through like a blade under the ribs. Dan wasn't surprised, but it still stung. Rex was declared unstable, pending removal from active service. Until further notice, he'd be barred from all public interactions, especially therapy visits. The hospital incident report didn't mention room 209. It focused solely on the bite, the disruption, and the disturbing behavior of a once decorated K9 unit. Dan stood in his kitchen, the letter trembling slightly in his calloused hands. Rex lay nearby, silent, his gaze never leaving the door, like he was waiting for something or someone. They think you've gone bad, Dan muttered, setting the paper on the counter. But you've never even flinched at a threat. Not once. Rex didn't react. He hadn't eaten since the hospital, hadn't slept either, not properly. He just stared at the door, alert and still. Dan had seen this kind of fixation before, in combat dogs, when they sensed IEDs or hidden enemies. It was instinct honed to a blade's edge, and right now Rex was locked onto something only he could sense. Dan tried to distract him, took him out for a drive, tried to coax him with his favorite ball. Nothing worked. The moment they passed the city limits and the outline of Memorial Hospital came into view, Rex stood up in the truck bed, ears perked. His body vibrated with tension, his gaze locked forward. Dan parked near the staff entrance, unsure what he was even doing there. He wasn't supposed to be within a mile of the place, not with Rex. But the dog leapt down before Dan could stop him and started pulling toward the building like the leash wasn't even there. Rex, Dan growled. Heel, the dog didn't. Listen. He stopped only when they reached the hospital doors, sitting down and staring inside. Watching, waiting. Dan sighed. He wasn't about to drag the dog into more trouble. He turned to leave, but then Rex let out a growl, not loud, just deep, from the chest. Dan followed his gaze. A man in a white coat had just stepped out through the side entrance. He wasn't moving like a doctor. Too stiff, too aware. His eyes flicked around like he expected someone to be watching. He didn't notice Dan, but Rex saw him and barked, just once, sharp and cutting. The man froze, then turned and walked quickly back inside. Dan squinted after him. He didn't recognize the guy. Something about him was wrong. Too clean, too practiced. He pulled out his phone and dialed. "Emma Brooks," a voice answered. Calm, professional. "It's Rourke," Dan said. "Need a favor?" There was a pause. "You know I got suspended for helping you last time, right?" "I know. And you're still calling me?" "I think there's something going on in that hospital. Something bad. You ever heard of Room 229? Silence, then. "No, that wing's supposed to be sealed off. Renovations?" "It's not. Something's in there. Someone." "You sure?" "No," Dan admitted. "But Rex is, and he's never been wrong." Emma exhaled into the phone. "Meet me at the parking garage in an hour. I'll bring my access badge." Dan hung up and looked down at Rex. The dog's eyes were still on the door, his muscles tense. "You're not crazy," Dan said quietly. "They just don't understand what you're trying to tell them." The hour crawled by. When Emma arrived, her scrubs were half covered by a coat, and her face was pale beneath her usual calm. "This better be worth it," she said. "I'm risking a lot."